Bullies mock the new black kid at school, unaware he's a skilled fighter. What happens next will leave you speechless. The first time Elijah Gaines walked through the halls of Ridgeway High, he could feel the weight of their eyes. The school was like any other. Cracked linoleum floors, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, students moving in clusters, their laughter and conversations blending into a dull, chaotic hum. But beneath all of that, Elijah could sense something else. It was an unspoken energy, the kind that always existed in places like this. It thrived in the quiet spaces between glances, in the shifting of shoulders when someone unfamiliar entered a room. It was the feeling of being observed, measured, assessed, not just for who he was, but for how he would fit into the unspoken hierarchy that governed the school's hallways. He had been here before, not in this exact school, not in this exact town, but in this exact situation. A new black kid in a predominantly white school, an outsider before he had even spoken a word. Elijah had spent years learning the patterns. There was always a routine, a predictable sequence of events that played out whenever someone like him arrived in a place like this. First came the stares, some fleeting, some lingering a little too long. Then came the whispers, the curiosity masked as casual conversation. And finally, the test. The moment where someone, always the same kind of someone, stepped forward to determine exactly where the new kid belonged. Elijah was quiet as he walked, his steps measured, his gaze calm. He wasn't small, not by a long shot, but he wasn't the biggest guy in the school either. His frame was athletic, lean but strong, the kind of build that didn't command attention at first glance, but carried an unmistakable presence. His clothes were simple, unremarkable. Dark jeans, a fitted hoodie, sneakers that had seen wear but still held their shape. He looked like a kid who might try to blend in, keep his head down, but that was a mistake people often made. It didn't take long for the first signs of trouble to show. By the time lunch rolled around, Elijah had already felt the quiet shift in the school's rhythm. He had noticed the way some conversations lowered when he passed, the way certain students lingered a second longer than necessary when they glanced in his direction. But he had ignored it, moving through the day as if none of it mattered, because, to him, it didn't. At least, not yet. The cafeteria was crowded, the noise level a constant murmur of voices layered over the clatter of trays and utensils. Elijah moved through the line quickly, grabbing a tray and scanning the room. He wasn't looking for a place to sit. He was looking for them, and he found them immediately. A group of boys sat at a corner table, their postures relaxed, but their attention sharp. It was a table that commanded space, the kind that had been claimed long ago and never challenged. There were 4 of them, but only 2 mattered. The first was Colby, stocky, broad-shouldered, with a face that carried the smug confidence of someone who had never been told no. He wore a Ridgeway High varsity jacket, the sleeves slightly stretched over arms that had spent years in weight rooms. His mouth curled into an easy smirk as he nudged the boy next to him. The second was Seth, lanky, with sharp cheekbones and a perpetual glint in his eye that hinted at something meaner than his frame suggested. He wasn't the leader, but he was the one who played instigator, the one who made things worse because he enjoyed it. Elijah recognized them immediately, not by name, but by type. He had seen them before, in every school, in every town. Predators who mistook themselves for kings. Colby muttered something under his breath, loud enough for the table to chuckle but too low for Elijah to hear. Then, Seth turned in his seat, his voice carrying easily over the cafeteria noise. He called out to Elijah, asking where he was from. But he didn't ask it like a normal person. There was an edge to it, something that curled the words into an insult before they even landed. His tone was casual, but the intent wasn't. He made a joke, something about prison, something meant to draw a reaction. A few students at nearby tables snickered, eyes darting toward Elijah to see what he would do. It was the first move in a familiar game. Elijah didn't answer. He never did. Not at first. Silence was the first test. Would they let it go, or would they push further? Colby wasn't the type to let silence slide. Bullies never were. He pushed his chair back, standing up with the kind of confidence that came from never having been challenged before. His height wasn't as impressive as his build, but it didn't need to be. He carried himself like a king addressing a subject. The table behind him was watching now, their conversation pausing as they waited to see how this would play out. Colby took a step closer, closing the space between them. His smirk deepened, his body language dripping with false amusement, the kind that masked the real intent beneath it. He made another comment, something about respect, something about teaching the new kid how things worked. The tension in the cafeteria shifted. A moment had formed, something delicate and thin, stretched between them like a wire waiting to snap. Elijah met his gaze, his face unreadable. And then, he smiled. It wasn't big, it wasn't forced, it was small, subtle. But it was the kind of smile that should have been a warning. Colby didn't see it. He wasn't the type to recognize danger until it was too late. But Elijah had seen this before, and he knew exactly where this was going. It started in the hallway after school. Elijah had been expecting it. He could always tell when someone like Colby wasn't finished. Bullies didn't let silence go unanswered. They needed a reaction, needed proof that they were in control. That was the only way they knew how to exist. If they weren't feared, they weren't anything at all. So, when he stepped outside and heard the sound of footsteps closing in behind him, he didn't even blink. The cool evening air had settled over the school grounds, the last few students filtering into their rides, their voices distant echoes against the pavement. But Elijah wasn't heading for the main parking lot like the others. His walk was deliberate, leading him toward the back lot, the place where no teachers parked, where there were no security cameras, no passing cars. And just as he had expected, they followed. Colby, Seth, two more of their friends. The pack had assembled. Elijah kept his posture relaxed, his hands in his pockets, his steps unhurried. He could hear the shuffle of their sneakers against the pavement, the cocky cadence of their movements. They thought they were hunting him, cutting him off from the safety of the crowd, isolating him in their chosen battleground. But they had made a mistake. Colby's voice rang out first, a smug drawl soaked in self-assurance. He was enjoying this. The tension, the inevitability of it. He lived for these moments, for the way power could shift so easily with just a few well-placed fists. Seth was the first to break the silence. His words dripped with mockery, his tone carrying that same lazy confidence. He spoke as though this was a game, as though Elijah was the one too stupid to understand the rules. He took a step forward, closing the distance ever so slightly, his body language testing the waters. Elijah still didn't respond. Colby wasn't patient. He stepped up next, his broad shoulders squared, his stance shifting in that telltale way that fighters always did before making their move. He rolled his shoulders like a wrestler preparing to charge, his body radiating the kind of aggression that came naturally to someone who had never been forced to fight for real. Elijah could see it all before it even happened. The weight shift, the tightening of muscles, the slight lowering of Colby's stance. He was getting ready. Colby made his final mistake then. He grinned, mistaking Elijah's silence for fear. He thrived on fear. He fed off of it, needed it. That was the kind of person he was, the kind who only understood the world in terms of who could be stepped on and who did the stepping. And then he swung. It was a sloppy punch, too wide, too slow, too full of arrogance. The kind of punch that had never needed to be accurate before because no one had ever fought back. But Elijah wasn't like the others. He moved like a shadow cutting through light, quick, precise, and merciless. Before Colby's fist could even come close to landing, Elijah stepped inside the punch, closing the space between them with a speed that left no time for adjustment. His elbow snapped forward in a brutal arc, colliding directly with Colby's throat. The impact was instant. Colby staggered back violently, his hands flying to his neck as a choked, strangled sound ripped from his throat. His knees buckled beneath him as his body struggled for breath that wouldn't come. His mouth opened, but nothing came out. Just a gasping wheeze, his face twisting in shock, in pain, in something almost like terror. The others froze. They had expected an easy win. They had never expected this, but Elijah wasn't finished. He never stopped at one. Seth reacted next, the instinctive response of someone who had never seen his leader fall before. His mind hadn't caught up to the reality of what was happening, hadn't processed that Colby was already done. Elijah was already moving. He pivoted, shifting his weight, and his foot snapped forward, slamming into Seth's ribs before he could react. The sound it made was sharp, sickening. Seth crumpled sideways, his body folding into itself as the air was knocked from his lungs. His feet tangled together as he went down, hitting the pavement with a wheeze, his limbs twitching as he struggled to suck in a breath. The third boy, a thick-set kid with a buzz cut, took a half-step forward, his brain struggling to decide whether to fight or flee. He didn't get the chance to choose. Elijah was already on him. His fist hammered forward with bone-crunching force, colliding with the kid's jaw so hard that his head snapped sideways before his body even realized it needed to fall. He hit the ground in a heap, his legs twitching, his eyes glassy, his mouth hanging open like he wasn't entirely sure where he was anymore. 3 down, 1 left. The last boy, Dean, wasn't moving. His wiry frame had gone rigid, his face pale. He wasn't stupid. He saw what had happened in seconds, saw how fast the situation had flipped. His breath hitched as he tried to step back, but Elijah was already in front of him. His hand shot out like a steel trap, grabbing Dean by the shirt and slamming him against the cold brick wall behind him. Dean's head bounced off the surface, his breath stuttering in his chest. His hands grasped at Elijah's wrist, but there was no give in Elijah's grip. Elijah leaned in close, his face unreadable, his breathing steady. And that, more than anything, terrified them. Elijah wasn't panting. He wasn't wild-eyed or shaking with adrenaline. He wasn't grinning like some lunatic who got off on violence. He was calm. Dean could feel it in the way Elijah held him, in the way his strength felt effortless, controlled. Dean's pulse hammered in his throat. Elijah had never been prey. And for the first time in their lives, they had learned what it felt like to be hunted. By the time word spread through Ridgeway High, Colby wasn't talking anymore. His throat was still raw from the strike, a deep, lingering ache that made even swallowing a painful reminder of what had happened. He had tried to hide it at first, walking into school with his usual posture, his usual scowl, but the moment he tried to speak and his voice caught. Thin, broken, weak. It was over. Seth had it worse. He could barely sit without wincing, the sharp edge of his cracked rib a constant companion with every breath. He moved differently now, more hesitant, like a man who had learned too late that he wasn't untouchable. The third boy, the one with the swollen jaw, barely spoke at all. His mouth was stiff, his words slow, as if forming them required effort he wasn't used to making. He kept his head down in class, no longer filling the silence with cheap jokes and loud arrogance. Whatever was left of his pride had been shattered along with his face. And Dean? Dean didn't come to school for a week. There were rumors. Some said his parents had taken him out of town, embarrassed by whatever excuse he had given them. Others whispered that he had stayed locked in his room, refusing to face the inevitable questions that came with defeat. No one knew for sure. But something had shifted in the air. It wasn't just about the fight. Ridgeway High had seen fights before. Kids throwing lazy punches in the parking lot, wrestling matches that turned into scuffles in the gym. Those were different. Those were petty, predictable, harmless. This was something else. The usual whispers that followed new students had changed. Elijah wasn't just the new black kid anymore. He was something else entirely. People started watching him differently. The shift was subtle at first, a quiet unease that wove itself into the way students moved around him. The casual glances that had once been filled with curiosity were now careful, calculating. Some students still stole looks, but they no longer lingered. They didn't challenge him with their eyes. They looked, then they looked away. In the hallways there was space around him that hadn't been there before, an invisible boundary that no one dared cross. Students walking toward him would instinctively adjust their path, giving him a fraction more room, as if they weren't even aware they were doing it. But they were. Some watched him with caution, their expressions guarded, as if trying to decipher whether he was dangerous or simply someone who refused to be prey. Some watched him with respect, their eyes carrying something different, not fear, but recognition. A quiet acknowledgement of what had happened, a newfound awareness that Elijah wasn't like the others, that he had never been like the others. And some watched him with outright fear. They had seen Colby's bruises. They had seen Seth wincing when he sat down. They had seen the hollow quiet in the third boy's gaze. And they had seen what wasn't there. Elijah hadn't been punished. There had been no call to the principal's office, no suspensions, no consequences. No one had said a word, because Colby and his crew hadn't said a word. The silence spoke louder than any confession. Colby had spent years carving his place at Ridgeway High, building his reputation on dominance, on control. His strength had never been physical alone. It had been authority. People followed him because they believed in the illusion that he was untouchable. But that illusion had been shattered, and everyone could see the cracks. Colby and his crew didn't come near Elijah again. They couldn't. Not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know how. They had been kings. Now, they had no kingdom. Because for the first time in their lives, they had learned what it felt like to be prey. Years passed. Most of the kids from Ridgeway High had long since forgotten the usual high school drama. The fights, the friendships, the stupid rivalries that had once seemed so important had faded into the background of time. The things they had once obsessed over, who sat where at lunch, who was dating, who ruled the hallways, became nothing more than distant memories, drowned out by the weight of adulthood. But they never forgot Elijah Gaines. Even after graduation, even after life had pulled them in different directions, the memory of him remained. He was not the kind of person who disappeared into the blur of the past. He did not fade like the others. He was the kind of name that lingered, passed between former classmates in hushed conversations years later. He was the one they remembered. Colby? He had learned to keep his mouth shut. He had spent the rest of his time at Ridgeway High walking the same halls he once ruled, but everything had changed. He had not been the same after that day. Something fundamental had shifted inside him, something that could not be undone. His confidence never fully returned. He never picked another fight, never looked for another target, never let himself believe that he was untouchable again, because he had been broken in a way that didn't fully heal. Seth carried his cracked rib as a reminder. He had felt it for weeks after the fight. The sharp pull of pain every time he twisted the wrong way, every time he laughed too hard, every time he breathed too deep. It had healed eventually, but not completely. Some wounds lingered, even when they were invisible. He had spent his final years at Ridgeway more cautious, quieter than before, as if something had been drained from him. Something he had once thought was unshakable. Dean still got nervous when people moved too fast near him. It was a reflex now, something that had buried itself deep inside him. A flash of movement in his peripheral vision, a sudden step too close, and his body reacted before his mind could tell him that there was no threat. He told himself it was nothing. Just a stupid fight. Just high school nonsense. But his hands still clenched at his sides whenever he thought about it. His stomach still twisted when someone stood too close. He had never talked about what happened, not to anyone, because the truth was, he didn't want to relive it. They had been the predators once. They had walked through Ridgeway High like kings, their presence commanding space, their reputations built on dominance. They had never imagined a day would come when someone would challenge them, when someone would strip them of their power so completely that they could never reclaim it. But that was before they met the one who didn't run, the one who didn't cower, didn't hesitate, didn't submit, the one who fought back, the one who showed them what it meant to fear, the one they never forgot.